Hello, my name is Bradley Hope, and I'm the co-author with Justin Sheck of Blood and Oil, the story of Mohammed bin Salman's rise to power. The recent intelligence report released by the United States, the declassified intelligence report, was really nothing new as far as people who have been watching this case for a long time. It essentially summarized some of the same information that was leaked out not long after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Essentially, it summarizes that the United States believes that Mohammed bin Salman would have been knowledgeable or possibly directed the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and it doesn't give any real detail about how it came to that conclusion. Obviously, some of those sources and methods are classified. I think probably the most important thing about it is it became public. It didn't really change our perspective. So it went from something that was leaked to a few select newspapers to something that was a public document that everyone can refer to, which is quite powerful. The timing's also interesting because obviously the new president, Joe Biden, authorized that release. So it was definitely set the tone of the relationship between this new government and the Crown Prince's government. Well, I think it did put him on a kind of defensive footing. Before now, he or his people, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, could have said, listen, these leaks it's unclear where they're coming from, they're not official. Now it is quite official. You know, the US government's kind of summary viewpoint from the intelligence is that Mohammed bin Salman is responsible. Now, what has happened is the same people that were critical of those remarks before are now saying there's nothing new in this report, it doesn't really explain what they're saying. And of course, Mohammed bin Salman himself denies that he was knowledgeable about this or had directed it, but he has said he, quote, takes responsibility because he's somebody at the top of the government and these people ultimately reported to him. I think the most important thing about this is that, under Mohammed bin Salman, obviously under Joe Biden, the relationship with Saudi Arabia is changing and is probably still evolving. It might even be too early to say what the relationship is going to be like. What Joe Biden has sort of signaled so far is that the United States will continue dealing with Mohammed bin Salman, his government. They've kind of snubbed him, saying that the correct person for President Biden to speak to is King Salman. That's obviously not the way that the previous government approached Mohammed bin Salman. Now, I do think, though, with the release of this intelligence report, the general kind of tenor of the foreign policy and intelligence establishment in the United States, that it's made it pretty clear that Mohammed bin Salman will not be welcomed into the United States in the short term. I think in the overall perspective, the government, the U.S. government, is sort of siding with this idea of, listen, we may have our issues with Mohammed bin Salman, but ultimately the relationship between these two countries is too important to really kind of put our foot down in a more, strenuous way. So essentially, it's all kind of optical. It's really giving him a hard time with his public image and not really helping him to clean his public image, but at the same time not really changing the status quo. I think the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has really kind of permanently changed the view of Mohammed bin Salman. Before that, he was really flying pretty high. He was able to visit the United States. He had this image of somebody who was bringing about reforms to Saudi Arabia, and even though during the course of those 5 years there was a lot of things he was doing that were people were critical of, he managed to rise above that criticism in the way that any president can kind of take criticism but still become popular. But the killing of Jamal Khashoggi really just permanently made a major change in that public image, especially from a Western audience. because he really went, from their eyes, from a reformer to sort of having characteristics of a totalitarian ruler, somebody who's willing to, their perception is that he's willing to authorize extrajudicial killings or kidnappings for people who are critical of his government. So that's the overriding image in the West. I personally see Mohammed bin Salman as a more complex figure than perhaps the common image that you find. I think he's someone who's very strategic. I don't think of him as someone who's erratic or emotional in his decision making. Though those first couple of years, there was a lot of kind of brash choices that were made. Choices made that there would have been a lot of people cautioning against them. I'm talking about the war in Yemen, the approach towards the corruption crackdown, where people were put into the Ritz without really any kind of proper judicial process. These things tended to come back and bite him as a sort of acting head of state. He's also someone who I think is very sensitive to his own image and the way he's perceived around the world. So he's probably quite upset with the way that people are characterizing him, and so that's actually probably a good thing in terms of international politics, because you want to have somebody who cares about how they're perceived. They're not just doing whatever they want despite the consequences. So I think we've seen in the last couple of years, especially since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, that Saudi Arabia has actually kind of tempered some of its activity as a state. We haven't heard of any more of these kind of extrajudicial kidnappings. There's obviously not been anything like the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And Saudi Arabia has kind of focused a little bit more inward on its interior economic development. And actually these reforms that Mohammed bin Salman has brought about are really the main focus now, because all of the international activity, it probably didn't really bear out to have the kind of benefits that he'd hoped when he'd taken those decisions. I'm talking about, obviously, the war in Yemen, which is, instead of becoming a quick strategic victory, has become one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, and the problem hasn't gone down at all. It's still just a highly risky situation right on its southern border. So obviously, one of the things Mohammed bin Salman has done is really powerfully consolidated power inside Saudi Arabia. He's essentially now running his father's court, his own court, the military, the intelligence, the economic apparatus, things like Aramco. Traditionally, Saudi Arabia had more of a balance of different people had control of these different entities. And there was a kind of rule by consensus approach, even though there was one king. Now it's really, the power is consolidated with Mohammed bin Salman. And so, and obviously the king is still the king, he's the ultimate decision maker. And if he should pass away or abdicate, it would mean that Mohammed bin Salman is really the unchallenged king of Saudi Arabia. And I think that's the most likely scenario that we're looking at right now. Inside Saudi Arabia, I think that would be generally accepted. I mean, his popularity hasn't taken a big hit despite the kind of Western criticism of him. Externally, many countries would probably be wishing they had a more mild person that was taking over Saudi Arabia, but ultimately they have no power to decide who becomes the next king, or even to really influence it in the way that they used to be able to influence it in the kind of earlier days of the kingdom. So I think Mohammed bin Salman is really the heir apparent without any real rivals. And in a way, the bigger question is less, will he become king? Because that seems quite clear. It's more, how will he kind of share power in the future? Who will be the crown prince? Will it be another member from his own family, the bin Salman, the sons of the king? Or will it be another person? What kind of succession planning will be Mohammed bin Salman's, thinking and decisions around that?